Today I'm with my longtime friend, Earl Kim. We've known each other for about 14 years. We first met at a Korean church summer retreat. So I used to go to Alliance Holiness Church, and he went to KUPC, I believe, Korean United Prespetarian Church. And we had mutual friends, so we hung out a few times in middle school, really reconnected in college at university when we both dormed at Monroe Halls. Earl, do you mind telling me a little bit about your background, like where you were born, where you grew up?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on and inviting me onto this. I was born in Chicago, pretty much raised in Skokie, which is a north suburb of Chicago for all my life. That's where I'm living right now with my family.
I know that when I talk to a lot of my Korean friends, the Korean church is a really big part of our upbringing. And so for me, someone that's half Korean and didn't grow up like around a Korean parent, do you mind kind of like speaking on how the Korean church is different than an American church?
I'll have to admit, I haven't been to like an American or a white church. I've been to self-proclaimed multicultural church. I think specifically the Korean church tends to focus on the concept of fellowship, and that's why in most Korean American immigrant churches there's lunch served afterwards, and that's where everyone gets together in like a huge cafeteria or like some other food hall, and they just eat together, catch up, and so that's a form of fellowship. And also another thing would be, I think, prayer. And Koreans are, especially like older Koreans, like traditional Koreans, are crazy about prayer, waking up at like 4 a.m. just praying for hours. I think those are the main differences that stick out to my mind.
Kind of like a structure of the different parents who help out, serving lunches and cooking the lunches. And there's like its own little like society within the Korean church too. At Alliance Holiness Church, the youth services were, taught in English, and then the adult services were usually Korean. So even if my mom tried to go, like, she wouldn't understand. How do you think the Korean church played a part in your development with your identity as seeing yourself as Korean, or just in like who you are today?
I think it definitely played a big role since I've been going for so long, probably since I was 5 or 6. In terms of how it helped me to realize my own Korean identity, it was just like the exposure to Korean culture in the church, because the lunch that was served pretty much always Korean food. Sometimes it'd be American, like on Thanksgiving. All the adults are speaking Korean, and even just our mannerisms as Koreans, it's just like a unique mixture of Korean values and also these Christian values and this Christian purpose, and somehow it becomes this unique own thing that other Christians don't have and other non-Christian Koreans don't have.
Do you mind speaking on the Korean values that you just mentioned, or like the Korean mannerisms that you spoke about?
A main one would be respect to elders, definitely, because I was raised to always bow. My mom specifically, she taught me to be like that, and so when like an elder would pass by, or just some like older person, I'd have to do the insa and be like 안녕하세요.
In terms of like being American, like how is that seen in Korea?
I'm not sure about nowadays, but definitely in previous years, kind of like awe, like, oh wow, you're American and you're Korean, like you know English so well. They would try to speak to you in English, practice their English, because a lot of Koreans know English in Korea. It's probably because of American media and how prevalent it is.
Like pop culture?
Movies too. They love our movies. They love Marvel movies.
I know that you went to Nicaragua for a few months after college. So do you mind telling me a little bit about that experience?
It was 2017. I graduated DePaul University. After graduating college, I always wanted to go on some sort of longer trip or like a volunteer trip, because I've already been on 2 previous trips to Costa Rica and Panama. So I thought after graduating college would be a good time to do that kind of thing before jumping into my career. And so I was fortunately connected through my church, who was partnered with the missionaries in Nicaragua, and I went over there. I was there for 6 months. It's outside the capital of Managua and more of like the rural area. I helped out the school administration there. I taught English, made relationships with the people there and with the students, and helped out at the church too.
And so while you were in Nicaragua, and I guess on your other like previous missionary trips in like South America, Latin America, do you mind speaking on your reception?
On all of the trips that I went to, the indigenous people that I was interacting with, they already had previous interactions with Koreans, Korean Americans, because just like how I would go on a mission team to a certain country, there are other, churches who want to do the same thing and they go to the same.
They already have like established relationships.
Yeah. So a bunch of them go to the same missionary. I think there's always, they notice, es un chino. It's like a different looking person. Later I found out that that's just how they call Asians. It's like us saying Asians, they just say chino, even though it literally means Chinese. There was never really any unwelcomeness. We were always welcomed, and I think it was pretty much because when people like me who would go on mission trips would go over there, we're just trying to help. We're just trying to give them what they need and just trying to uplift their spirits.
Do you mind going into like the age range of students that you taught, and I guess like what kind of comments you would hear?
So I taught mainly like 4th, 5th grade to 11th grade when I was in Nicaragua. It would be like the English period that I would teach. I would be the designated English teacher, and also helping teach and organize the after-school English program. In terms of any disrespect that I've gotten, not really much from the younger kids. There's one specific time that I remember with the 10th graders. I was trying to teach a grammar lesson or something, and they just weren't having it that day. It was just like every word you said to them, it just bounced off. It got to the point where they started making fun of me and like making the slant eyes towards me, and I probably heard chino like once or twice during that, and of course I got angry. I just wanted to continue on with my lesson and teach some English. So I kicked them out, made them go to the principal's office. I didn't really talk to them about it after that. I just acted out of emotion. I probably should have had like a one-on-one discussion with them, looking back.
Growing up, who were some Asian figures that you looked up to? Did you have any?
No.
Are there any Korean or Asian male role models that you see in the media now that are available for this generation of kids to look up to?
I think definitely in the mainstream, it's growing a lot more, but especially with YouTube, I feel like Asian Americans definitely dominate YouTube. A bunch of comedians, bunch of
makeup artists,
just artists in general, like videographers, that type of thing. So
like Wanfu Productions,
right,
Asian Boss.
Just Kidding Films, David So, he's a big one. Especially in this time that we're living in, it's becoming a lot more digital. Everything's on the internet. Most of it is on YouTube, a lot of entertainment. I really see that trend growing, like the Asian American trend, where younger Asian Americans can actually have someone to look up to.
In those pop culture ways, that's how like Americans, as well as people around the world, are getting into Asian culture, like cosplaying, like dressing up as like an anime character and going to conventions for it. At first, that used to be like a niche. Only a certain type of person would like do that, but I think now it's becoming more mainstream and acceptable to like have those interests. When people find out that I'm Korean, they like visibly get excited. Like they're just like so excited. They want to like talk to me. They want to share what they know. I was wondering if you've ever experienced that too, where you realize that people are like really excited to talk to you, or like excited to find out that you're Korean.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing that's becoming more prevalent nowadays, with K-pop and the rise of Korean skincare and Korean food and all that. Sometimes when I meet strangers, they hear this thing about K-pop, or like they love bibimbap. That's usually the case.
Like they have to share what they know with you, and you're just like,
I know.
Hey.
I do like that, a good conversation starter, and immediately off the bat, there's like that commonality where you can kind of form and kind of start a relationship.
Growing up, did you feel like your Asian heritage made you stand out, or did you kind of fit right into your environment?
I kind of fit right into my environment. Growing up in Skokie, being a super diverse community, bunch of Jewish people, Middle Eastern people, Arabic people, and also Asians, Filipinos, Chinese, Korean, Europeans too, and Africans, Hispanic cultures. Going to school with that kind of diversity, I didn't really feel like I was left out.
I wanted to talk about your time in college. DePaul is a majority like white school, and rowing and crew is like a majority white sport. Did you ever feel like your ethnicity or your difference came up during your time at DePaul, during your time on the crew team?
Not really. I've never been exposed to so many white people in like a specific place, and it kind of made me forget that I'm Asian and that I look different, and then I kind of felt like I was white. There's so many white people around me and kind of forgot like my culture, my background, and just blended in. My friends in college, mostly white, they didn't really ask too much about my own culture, and so and we just talked about other similarities and things that we can relate on. We just talked about that kind of stuff. That's also probably a reason why I kind of forgot my Asianness.
From my time studying abroad in China, I know that Chinese people have an interesting opinion or relationship with Japanese people just because of Japan's colonialization or conquering of China. And I know that Japan has also invaded and conquered Korea. So do you mind like speaking on what you know about that?
It was probably, I think the year is 1910, early 1900s, that Japan really started ramping up their military and industrialization. And so they invaded and colonized Korea for around 35 years. And that ended after they lost World War II and they surrendered. They continued on to Manchuria, invading that part of China and other parts of China, Indonesia, Philippines, a lot of the islands. Yeah, a lot of people don't know how badly Koreans, and also the other countries too, but speaking as a Korean, how bad Korea was treated. It wasn't just like they took over and they were just taking our resources and that kind of thing. It went to
like rapes and
right.
slavery.
Like using our women to fulfill the sexual desires, sexual needs of the Japanese soldiers. They were called comfort women, which is still a standing issue today because I think there's one comfort woman that's still living. And it's also a big issue because I don't think the Japanese government formally made an apology. And there was also a whole Japanization that happened. Definitely tried to wipe out Korean culture and implement Japanese culture, Japanese language, Japanese values onto the Korean people, forcing it on them, taking their land, killing them, torturing Koreans. That happened not just in Korea, but throughout Southeast Asia. I don't know if it's still happening, but there's a trade war going on with South Korea and Japan. Learning all of these facts from my parents and doing my own research. Of course, I have this built up Korean prideful resentment, not against the Japanese people or anything, but just against the government and like what Japan used to represent back then. There's that resentment that I'm not proud of and I'm ashamed of. It's just like I'm trying to get over it. The Koreans are a super pride people. I think it comes from the fact that we're such a small country and so many people packed into like this largely mountainous peninsula. For hundreds of years, we've survived attacks from China and Japan and a bunch like the Mongols too. Generations of that kind of built like this Korean rage and this Korean pridefulness, be like pure-blooded Korean or whatever. I don't think that's a huge thing. I think the reason why parents would want their children to marry Korean or whatever is because they also have that same culture and raised with those same values and they speak the language too, maybe. In that sense, it's more of a personal thing.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Earl. I appreciate your perspective and your knowledge about Korean culture and history.
I had fun with this.